We have correspondents in Ankara, at Unjupinar on the Turkey-Syrian border, and in Moscow covering this story. First, let's go to TRT World's Alican Ayanlar in the Turkish capital. Alican, what's the latest in terms of the diplomatic effort from Ankara? Who has the government been speaking to?
Well, Adnan, as the military operation ramps up, the channels of diplomacy here in the Turkish capital of Ankara are just as active. Now, prior to the start of the operation, the Turkish Foreign Ministry has been in very close contact with all of its strategic allies, as well as other countries from the region, particularly the United States, the Russian Federation, and Iran. And these countries are important because they play a very active role in the ongoing civil conflict in Syria. Now, Turkey's Foreign Minister, Ahmed, had an in-depth conversation with his U.S. counterpart, Rex Tillerson, prior to the start of this operation, informing them of this imminent operation. Now, this was particularly important because the enemy for the Turkish military in this operation, dubbed Olive Branch, was going to be a group that shared a very close relationship with the United States, and that was the YPG. Now, it also comes at a time on the backdrop of when the U.S. had announced its intentions of training tens of thousands of YPG troops along the Turkish-Syrian border. Now, this was unacceptable in the eyes of the Turkish government. So it was very important that the channels of communication were open to avoid any extra tension in this already uneasy relationship between these two NATO allies. But now that the operation has started, Turkey is continuing to play its cards in a very open manner. It's in constant contact with a lot of countries, including all of the members of the permanent United Nations Security Council, updating them on the latest developments on the ground, including making a good case in why Turkey had to conduct this military operation.
So as the political efforts continue, do we know if any of Turkey's aims in Operation Olive Branch have changed or even been modified a little bit because of concerns of other parties who have interests in Syria? And there are so many of those. Indeed,
there are. There have been some requests, namely from the United States, in terms of changing some things, but whether Turkey considers these, time will tell, and it is unlikely. The U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis did come out and say that they recognize that Turkey was the only country within the NATO alliance that actually had an active insurgency within its own borders, and it was because of this they recognized some of the issues like national security. But that being said, they went on to say that they requested from Turkish authorities to limit the scope and duration of this military operation. That is unlikely. Another change, not in form of a request, but in terms of a move, came from the Russians after the close consultation between Turkey's Foreign Minister Mevlut and Russia's Sergei Lavrov. The Russian Defense Ministry decided to move about 200 troops that were previously based in Afrin, which is going to be the center of this military operation, to a safer zone in a city or a town called Tel Rifat, which is further east of Afrin, to avoid any direct contact of this military operation. So a change and a request coming from the U.S. and Russians, but no strategic change in terms of the military strategy from the Turkish side.
OK, let's go to Ahmed al-Burai, who's on the Turkey-Syria border. Ahmed, what sort of force, what sort of power is the Turkish military up against? What do we know about the YPG?
What we know, Adnan, from the inside the Afrin region, that the YPG militants are roughly between 10,000 and 12,000. They do have some of the weaponry that was supplied to them by the United States, as Donald Trump and his administration publicly stated that they will continue supplying them with different weapons in order to start fighting Daesh. But the problem was they promised Turkey to disarm the group as far as Daesh was defeated. But Daesh was defeated and these groups were not disarmed, and that was angered the Washington's ally here in Turkey, and this operation started. Now, in terms of the logistics on the ground, these groups are well trained by the guerrilla warfare with their fight with the Daesh. They were believed to be the best fighters in terms of defeating Daesh and the main allies of the United States. But for Turkey, they're considered as the offshoot, the branch of the PKK terror group, and they constitute a major threat to Turkey's national security. That's why Turkey is unequivocally not going to back down and is going to go on with this olive branch operation to neutralize all these elements from its border. Now, from Manbij, the supply can come, and that's why the Turkish president always speaking about Manbij in the east of the Euphrates Shield region, in order to cut all these supply lines coming from Manbij to Afrin, in order to neutralize the region and put the enclave of Afrin under complete siege of the Turkish military and the Free Syrian Army.
Just briefly, Ahmed, you've been across different points of the border over the past few days. What have you seen in terms of activity?
One of the stories I'd love to share, Adnan, is Abu Ahmed's story, one of the Syrian refugees who came from Syria 4 years ago, from Aleppo in particular, escaping with his 4 children, the war there. And he told me when I met him after the attack of the YPG on this particular city on the border with Syria, Kilis city, he told me that the horrors that he escaped from in Syria visited him and his family when the attack happened by the YPG. They fired a number of rockets toward this city were available, and they injured at least 7. They killed 1 in Rayhanli and injured other 40 in that city. Now, this man wanted to integrate and live in peace in this community with his children. He couldn't because of the ongoing violence here. On the other hand, you have in Azaz, in the city behind me, the place where the Free Syrian Army is going to take part in the operation. One of the Kurdish nationals, one of the Kurdish Free Syrian Army fighters, told me that he originally is from Afrin and he was forcibly evicted from his own city. He is going to take part in the operation and go back to recapture the city from these elements who do believe that they do not represent the revolution of the Syrian people and the aspiration of the Syrian people. They do have their own agenda. That's why he is going to continue. So you have many humanitarian stories and human stories here. It is a major catastrophe that this ongoing war could cause to the civilians on both sides.
Finally, Dan Ashby in Moscow, just sum up the Russian position for us on this latest development in the Syrian war.
Adnan, it's been a relatively reserved and cautious response from Moscow. They've merely said today that they are observing the situation. They have confirmed that they have been in contact with both the Syrian and Turkish leadership, and they have come out and emphasized that they want all sides to respect Syrian territorial integrity. The Kremlin spokesperson wouldn't be drawn on whether Russia knew about this military offensive beforehand, but in previous statements from the Foreign Office in the last 3 days, they did express some concern about information about the military offensive and really said to all sides to show restraint. So as of yet, there is no strong criticism from Russia, some expression of concern, but really they've taken this opportunity to express their vision, their targets and aims for Syria, which is to continue to work towards that ceasefire in the de-escalation zones.
Alican, Ahmed, Dan, thank you very much. Let's open up the conversation to our panel now. In Washington, D.C., we have Lawrence Korb. He's a former Assistant Secretary of Defense. In Moscow, Viacheslav Matuzov joins us, a former Russian diplomat. And here in the studio in Istanbul, Galip Dalay, a research director for Sharq Forum, a think tank focused on the Middle East. And also here, his colleague from the Sharq Forum, Sinan, Hatahet, who has worked with the Syrian National Coalition, and you are a Syrian national, sir. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. But Sinan, I'd like to start with you. Sure. Just explain to us, who are these YPG units that Turkey is fighting? And most importantly, are they the same YPG units that helped defeat Daesh in other parts of Syria?
Well, the YPG forces are to a large degree grassroots, forces in Syria, but with leadership coming from the PKK. So we have Kurdish, Turkish leadership, and as well as Iranian Kurdish PKK leadership that are at the top of the hierarchy. As for the composition of the YPG forces in Afrin, the YPG force in Afrin has some Kurds in it, has also some Arab fighters that have been recruited over the last 3 years, but they haven't engaged ISIS as their other colleagues east to the Euphrates. They have actually engaged the Syrian opposition while they were defending their towns from ISIS attacks in 2015. And when we speak about the current situation in Afrin, there are around 11 towns, Tel Rafat, Menir, and the surrounding are all Arab towns that have been taken by the YPG while the opposition, national opposition, was defending Mari' from an imminent ISIS attack. So they haven't really engaged ISIS. They have mostly engaged the Syrian opposition. They have also participated in the besieging of city of Aleppo in 2016 and were in close collaboration and cahoots with the Syrian regime.
Lawrence Korb, you see, right at the start of Sinan's answer there came the very crux of the matter as far as Turkey is concerned, because as soon as anyone almost mentions the YPG, then you get its Turkish partner, the PKK, being mentioned. And the United States has been working with the YPG, and it's a week-old story about the border force that the United States wanted to help train and arm in that part of Syria that is so close to Turkey. And you get the issue of Turkey saying to its American ally, why are you working with the YPG? Because they're effectively the PKK.
Well, the United States position was with what we call the Syrian Democratic Forces, which not only included Kurds, but included Arabs. And without that force, ISIS would not have been defeated. They're the ones who 2 years ago took Kobani, that really reversed the trend that ISIS was having. And then, of course, they took Raqqa. And the United States wants to ensure that ISIS doesn't come back. And if you don't ensure that the Syrian Democratic Forces are there, the very good chance ISIS would come back. You also, unless the United States keeps a small number of troops in there to work with them, you're going to have Iran get more influence. You're going to have the Assad government and the Russians actually kill an awful lot of innocent people who've come up to that area fleeing the horrible things that Assad has done. I hope, Prime Minister Erdogan, said that this would be a swift operation. I hope it is, because the longer it goes on, nobody's going to get ahead. The Iranians will profit, the Russians will profit, and I support what the French have said. We need a UN Security Council meeting to work out all of this. And it's important to keep in mind that not every YPG person is concerned with the PKK. You can't conflate them. We had no problem when we armed the Syrian Democratic Forces with them doing anything in Turkey. It was all in Syria to fight ISIS.
There are so many acronyms, Lawrence Korb. I'm sure you also understand that many people believe that the Syrian Democratic Forces is just simply a rebranding of the YPG. What is the American involvement? When is it going to end in terms of how much it works with the YPG? Is it effectively going to give them weapons and tell them how to fight wars?
Basically, what the United States is doing, we're leaving troops there, which Secretary Tillerson, mentioned. And this whole question, as Secretary Tillerson said, about arming them was overstated. We have provided them with equipment up to now to defeat ISIS. And when ISIS is defeated and you have a political settlement in Syria, then the United States will withdraw its support for the Syrian Democratic Forces. But up until then, we can't just walk away and let this place descend into chaos again.
Viacheslav Matuzov, what do you say to Lawrence Korb when he says if the Americans don't work with the YPG, with the SDF, that Assad will benefit, that Russia will benefit, that Russia's friend, the leader of the Syrian regime, will go about committing more atrocities?
Well, I think that Russian position is it called for all sides involved to end the military hostilities and to try to solve these issues by political means. My opinion is that Russian interest in giving chance for Kurdish population in Afrin and other places in Syria, all Syrians should be considered as a Syrian citizen. And I think that if the command of military command of Kurdish forces in Afrin, in Manjab, in other places, will acknowledge the priority of Syrian government, that they are Syrian, not foreigners. I think that for Syrian government it's very easy to find where is the foreigners that are staying in Syria unlawfully and where is the Syrian citizens. I think that it is the split over terrorists, as it's blamed by Turkish side, could be solved by Syrian government. That's our preferable thing. But anyhow, what is caused this movement of military and army of Free Syrian Army and supported by the Turkish army? I think it is American maneuvering in Kurdish sphere, because they proclaimed about the preparation of training some military forces for guarding borders, about 30,000 militaries. I think it is the main reason why it was considered as a danger for Turkey. I think that our Russian side understand the Turkish concern about its national security. That's why a Russian reaction on Turkish involvement in military actions in Syria was not supportive, but it is on understandable base, because it is a reason why, because they are strengthening Kurdish forces, and that are from American side are oriented against Syrian government. But it is not only against Syrian government, because it is also against Turkish government.
Okay, Viacheslav Matuzov, thank you. Listen, just let
opportunity
please.
For establishing good relations.
Okay, let me bring Galip, Dalay in. Viacheslav Matuzov seems to be saying that what his foreign minister is saying, Sergei Lavrov, that the Russians are blaming the Americans for forcing Turkey to take action, but could Turkey be doing this operation inside Syria without the Russians giving the okay? Because there are reports that the Russians have withdrawn their people from Afrin, although Sergei Lavrov says we haven't, because that doesn't look good. And the SDF is saying that it's immoral for the Russians to withdraw from Afrin. But basically, could Turkey be doing it without the okay from Moscow?
Well, it's clear by now that there was a deal between Turkey and Russia, and therefore, this deal was very instrumental for this operation to take place. The fact that basically the airspace of the Afrin is controlled by Russia, and the fact that Turkey undertook the first phase of the operation was Turkey undertaking a very heavy aerial bombardment means that there was a deal. But the question is, what was the motivation behind the deal? One of the major motivation is perhaps both countries' disillusionment with the U.S. I mean, it's very clear that Turkey is very much disillusioned with the U.S. policy. It's very clear that Russia is disturbed and disillusioned by the U.S. policy as well too, regarding the regarding the U.S. long-term commitment or open-ended commitment to remain in Syria and to basically further continue to work with the SDF, which the backbone of which is basically formed by the YPG. So this was one of the major factors that Turkey felt that it had no choice but to pursue its own policy through engagement with Russia. And the fact that Russia wants to keep Turkey in the game of Astana process, the game of now the Sochi process, which was very crucial for Russia also to not to disillusion Turkey, because if Turkey withdraw from this process, more or less this process will crumble, because it is the Turkey that brings legitimacy to this Astana and Sochi process, because in the end, Russia and Iran are both the bakers of the regime. It is the Turkey that is the baker of the opposition, and therefore, like, you know, in order for this process to be seen as legitimate and credible, the inclusion or the participation of Turkey is crucial. So I think this was one of the major factors that was, you know, that was shaping the deal between Turkey and Russia. The secondly is what I see the dynamic that took place during the Euphrates Shield operation is taking place is here as well too. I mean, it was again the price that Turkey to some extent had to pay for the Euphrates Shield operation was more or less, you know, tacitly accepting the fall of the regime and the fall of the Aleppo to the regime forces. Right now, perhaps we might see a similar dynamics to take place in the eastern part of the Idlib. So we have to very much carefully watch what is regime planning to do in the eastern part of the Idlib, because this will tell us whether the same dynamic is in place. I mean, judging by the attempt of the regime yesterday to try to take over the Abu Duhur airport, does tell us to some extent that this dynamic is still in place. And unfortunately, as a result of this crisis, one of the major winner of this is the, you know, a genocidal regime or murderous regime of Assad, because as a result of this, Assad is seem to be like, you know, gaining more legitimacy, and unfortunately, Iran is also another winner as well too.
Viacheslav Matuzov in Moscow, what's the trade-off here? What is Russia getting from Turkey in allowing Turkey to conduct this operation, if allow is the right word? President Erdogan of Turkey says, we're not asking permission from anybody, but many observers believe that Russia was consulted and gave the okay for this operation.
I can say that Russia doesn't trade in this strategic important issue as a war in Syria, because Russia has a clear position. It is for peaceful solution of Syrian crisis, political solution. Sochi, Astana, and Geneva, this is the steps that they were supported by Russia enthusiastically. I think that war against and entering Turkish army to Syria is not welcomed by Russia and in general, because it is not welcomed by Syrian government, the main partner of Russia in Syria. I think that we consider that Turkey has a reason to enter, because it is concerned about its national security. And national security endangered because of increasing military support to Kurdish forces. Kurdish forces and they call it democratic Syrian forces, but it is Kurdish forces in base. That was brought Turkey to the idea to enter Syrian territory against the will of Syrian government, against the recommendations of Russia. But Russia met with Shoigu, the Minister of Defense of Russia, met some days ago with Chief General Staff of Turkish Army and his intelligence chief in Moscow, and they received some kind of understanding of Turkish concern.
Okay, Lawrence Korb, sorry, Vyacheslav, I have to stop
Russia
you there.
Doesn't.
We're running out of time. Lawrence Korb, how concerned are you that this development is just another example that Ankara and Washington are drifting further and further apart, and everybody but everybody believes that that is not the right way to go, that these two allies need to stay closely knit?
Well, I am concerned about it because the United States and Turkey are allies. We're both members of NATO. We have to deal with the increasing threat of Russia in Eastern Europe. So I hope that the United States can work with Turkey to stop this violence, stop these attacks, and then work out a political solution that guarantees that the YPG does not become part of the PKK, but also ensures ISIS doesn't come back, Iran doesn't increase its influence, and that millions of Syrians who fled the battles, their lives are protected.
OK, gentlemen, let's end with you in the studio here. Sinan, President Erdogan says this is going to be a quick operation. He can't know that for sure.
Well, the first phase by which the Turkish army with the local allies, the FSA, will advance and liberate the Arab towns of Tel Rafat and the surrounding will most probably happen in a quick succession. There already have been defection from some of the SDF forces, especially the Arab forces that are time over time, championed by the Americans. The Arab forces themselves that are part of the SDF are defecting now that they are under attack, and they are joining the assailants. So these towns are most probably going to be liberated in a quick fashion. But once we reach the mainland, where Afrin and this mostly Kurdish population, there will be many obstacles. The main obstacles is the presence of around 800,000 civilians that are currently being prohibited and prevented from fleeing the area. And this is where definitely we would like everyone included, would like to see more prudent approach to the liberation of the city.
Galip, can you give me a quick summary of what you believe will be a victory for Turkey in this operation? What will they be able to term a success?
Well, any reduction in the size of the PYD presence in Afrin or the surrounding area will be seen as a victory.
What if they just move 100 kilometers away? That's not a victory.
That's a question right now. Actually, success and victory, or the ultimate goals, are all different things right now. Right now, what I see is that, it's a pushback strategy by Turkey. Turkey is trying to push back YPG or PYD as much as possible. But nevertheless, the ultimate victory will be will have to be seen quite in political and strategic terms, because up until this moment, Turkey tried to contain YPG. This is the first operation in which Turkey tried to push it back, because the Euphrates operation did not directly target the PYD, even though the strategic strategic target of this operation was the PYD. The Turkish incursion in the Turkish entry into the Idlib was, again, not directly targeting the PYD, even though, again, one of the goals of this was to stop the PYD's westward expansion. So at this stage, it is the pushback strategy, and as much as Turkey feels that it can do, it will see this as a success. But nevertheless, right now, the political and strategic goals of the operation are yet to be known. It's not very clear yet.
Gentlemen, here in Istanbul and also Washington and in Moscow, thanks to all four of you for sharing your views with us on the Newsmakers. Thank you.